Hey everyone, thank you for joining me for a video today. I know it's been a while, I haven't been feeling well, health-wise. Things just kind of changed and shifted to I'm not in the best of conditions anymore, but it's fine. I'm here now. I'm going to make this video. And I did have a couple of things I wanted to talk about, so I might save those for future videos, or I might even just throw a poll out there to see if anybody even answers to see which video you'd like me to talk about next. I don't know how I'm going to do it just yet. But let's go ahead and get into today's topic, in which, surprise, we're going to talk about Zelda again. So if that's not your cup of tea, you're tired of hearing about Tears of the Kingdom, go somewhere else. I'm going to talk about it today. I've talked about it in the past. Some other channels have talked about it also, about how we're sort of ending this cycle. There's this theory that we're ending this cycle. And so some people might be concerned, well, does that mean this is the end of Zelda? Because it's a big, popular series from Nintendo, and that feels like it's shooting them in the foot if they end Zelda. I don't think they're going to be ending Zelda. But when we say, or at least this is my take on it, when we say that we're ending the cycle, we're ending the cycle of demise and his curse. This is how I take it when they say they're ending the cycle. Because Zelda is basically a ongoing cycle of, and if you played Skyward Sword, you know the story. You defeat Demise, and he says, nah, bud, this ain't it. I now curse you to forever come back. There's always going to be an evil that steps up to take my role of trying to destroy Hyrule. There's always going to be a hero who steps up to save me, and Zelda is going to forever come back. That is my curse. And of course we know this because we have living incarnates of Zelda. We had the goddess Hylia, who took on physical form in Zelda. She lived on. She had other children, all named Zelda, throughout the years, and those were physical people that had the power of the goddess in them that was never awakened. But as we started to see in Breath of the Wild, Zelda, that version of Zelda, started to get the goddess's powers sort of awakened in her. So I believe that we're going to get Zelda's powers fully unlocked in this game. She'll be able to fully take on the goddess incarnate again, basically becoming Hylia or some physical version of Hylia. Pull Demise out in some ways, and we defeat him and we end that curse. That's what I mean by that. Because we're kind of coming full circle again. We're getting islands in the sky, just like we started off with Skyward Sword. The end of Skyward Sword, of course, all the islands came down and they started to create Hyrule. So we're getting kind of a reverse here. You can kind of see where it's going. But I don't think it's going to end. And the reason why is because, hey, what happened at the end of Wind Waker? We killed Ganondorf. But that wasn't the end of that timeline. No, we got... what? Was it Ballas? I don't remember his name. That weird eyeball thing from Phantom Hourglass. And then, of course, we got Spirit Tracks, and another enemy that kind of is like Ganon in pig form. So the simple matter of the fact is, another evil rose up. So even if we defeat Ganondorf, and even if we defeat Demise, and we end the curse, that doesn't mean that evil stops existing in Hyrule altogether. There's probably going to be some other monster that steps up. There's probably going to be some other side story that takes place. After all, how many, and even if you think about how the timeline has been before, where it's like, hey, here's this game that's furthest along in the timeline right now, but now we're going to go in the middle. We're going to do like a Minish Cap or something that's now in the middle. You see what I'm saying? So we could easily go back in the timeline and say, okay, this is another version, this is another tale in the Child timeline. This is another tale before the end of the timeline somewhere in the middle. Could easily do that. So one, I don't think that's the end of The Legend of Zelda. It's probably just going to be the end of this particular cycle, this particular story loop. And they might do something else. Because if you think about it, before, up until Skyward Sword, we didn't even have a story loop like this. And Skyward Sword came out on the Wii. Before then, it just seemed like, here's an evil, here's Link, here's Zelda, here's the Triforce. You see what I'm saying? It just kind of seemed like it's something that we just played and just enjoyed. It wasn't really until we started getting into later games that we now suddenly are like, oh, now we're starting to get into this whole backstory thing. And we could even go further back with the next game. We can go further back and sort of explain the rise of Demise. This war that was talked about with Demise and the goddess Hylia in Skyward Sword. We can go back and see the starts of that and the hero, and play the hero that's in that game. So no, I don't think that's going to be the end of the games. It might be the end of this particular timeline. They might do some kind of weird offshoot where it's like the events of this just, made the circle continue to now go back to the beginning. Because I think it's going to be kind of weird. If you think about it, this might be some weird loop stuff where the events of this game caused the goddess Hylia to come back and entrap Demise again. And then all the islands are up in the sky, so it circles back around to Skyward Sword. I don't know, it might be one big circle, because it does show that Ouroboros, the infinite thing in the back, which to me is probably what the big spoiler is. And who knows, it may cause a whole different timeline. Just like the events of Ocarina of Time were so important to the timeline that it made 3 timeline branches. The events of this game might be so important that it might make 3 timeline branches. I mean, if you look at it, this isn't anything new for Nintendo. Now, granted, Age of Calamity isn't exactly officially canon. Nintendo made it a deal like it is canon, but it's not really officially canon, so you can't really say that. This point doesn't really make a whole lot of sense in context to that. But even if you take that game as an example, the heroes were dead. The heroes were dead in Breath of the Wild. They died. So in Age of Calamity, when the scene comes up where they're supposed to die, and the heroes of the future, the ones that take their place in Breath of the Wild, go back in time and stop them, for now they both exist like 1,000 years ago, or however long they said it was between the games. Okay, well, you just now created another branch where these heroes lived instead of died like they were supposed to. So just because this, again, loop might end, or this game might end, Demise might die, and just, be erased forever, and his curse no longer exists, doesn't mean that there won't be another curse, or that we don't get another timeline somehow, because his existence is supposed to be so important that he's supposed to exist. So therefore we have a Demise timeline where he wins, he's not defeated, and his existence continues, and then one where, almost like the Downfall timeline, where he is dead, but now Hyrule is going in a different direction because of his death. This is what happens when time continues and doesn't continue to loop like it. The cycle doesn't continue to loop like it does. That's just a theory. Just like, again, how Ocarina of Time was so important that, hey, Link dying in this game and not being able to fulfill his prophecy means that we have a whole downfall of Hyrule. That's the reason why we have this downfall timeline. But then he wins, and now you have a whole new event where it's like, well, this is his life when he wins, and he goes back and lives his childhood, and this is one where he continues as an adult. So it's like, This kind of game feels like it's that important that we might see another split. It's just a theory. Of course, everything at this point is a theory when it comes to Zelda, isn't it? Especially because, one, it's months until the game comes out. We don't have any kind of information like that. And two, it's all just theories until we play the game and months go by and we've had a chance to deep dive into every single part of it and sort of see where the connections are. And until Nintendo even officially comes out and states that, yes, Breath of the Wild is the timeline reconnected again somehow, we don't really know. And then, going back to that point, if Breath of the Wild is all three of the timelines combined back into one, what happens in the middle? What happened that makes those timelines reconnect? Because they say it's so far in the future that the timelines have all reconnected somehow, which doesn't really seem like it's a tangible thing that could really happen. I don't think time works like that. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Who knows? But even if it does, just thousands and thousands of years between the last games that we got and each of the timelines and when Breath of the Wild will come back together, that we can tell more stories. So I don't think it's the end of Zelda. No. Not by a long shot. Because even with Metroid, perfect example, Metroid is one of my favorite series from Nintendo. And we thought for the longest time that Metroid Prime 3 was the end of the Prime series. Now we're getting a 4, supposedly getting a 4. And just because 3 was the end of the series doesn't mean that we didn't get stuff like Federation Force and Hunters that were in the middle. You see what I'm saying? Hunters took place in the middle, I think between 1 and 2. Metroid Prime itself, the whole series, takes place in the middle of the Metroid timeline. I think it's in between the events of 1 and 2. So after Metroid 1 and before the return of Samus, you get the Prime series. And now we're at the end, supposedly, with Metroid 5, otherwise known as Metroid Dread, and it's supposedly the end. But we got a whole bunch of stuff set up now to where Samus could continue her own way, or we can get stories in between. We can get something to say, this happens between Fusion and Dread. This happens between Metroid Prime 2 and Super Metroid. Just because we're at the end of this timeline, or even if we are at the end of this timeline, and that's a big if, doesn't mean it's the end of the Zelda games. Doesn't mean we're not going to get some other timeline, some other curse, some other thing that happens that keeps the games going. Because those comments are right. There is too much money in Zelda games. They make a buttload of money on Zelda games. There's too much money for them just to let it go. But those are just my thoughts, guys. What do you think about all this? Make sure you leave a shout out. I'd love to hear what you have to say. But I hope you have a good day and a good weekend, and I'll talk to you later.